Whoa! I've dug through all our collection, and you know what? We've been doing an inventory in the new year, and gone through all of our Sega stuff because I'm an OG Sega fanboy. That's what I grew up with in retro gaming. That is the beginning of my retro game story. So in the next month or so, I want to go through the whole history of Sega and sort of use what we have as a basis to talk about Sega. We're going to start all the way back with the Master System, which is what I started with. But before that, I'm going to have a little look through what we have here. We have pretty much everything, I think. All the consoles, and a lot of people don't know the history of Sega. It actually goes all the way back to New York City. See, before they had electronic games and all of that fancy stuff, they had coin-op games like Baffle Ball, and that's the history of pinball. And there was a man there that later moved to Hawaii, and he started selling jukeboxes, slot machines, those early pinball and coin-op amusement games to American service people in Hawaii. Now that was a good business until, the Americans said, we don't want gambling on our army bases. So, they moved their operations to Japan, okay, and tried to service the people there. So they made a company called Service Games. Originally it was Standard Games, and then they changed to Service Games. Now, Service Games, S-E-G-A, that's Sega right there. So it's actually an American company in origins in some ways. And they eventually merged with something called Rosen Games to get very complicated. Then it was sold to another company called Golf and Western, and split off to multiple companies, and then it was sold again. But basically, after a while, they became known in the arcade space. They started developing their own games, and they got in the arcade business. And now Sega became really known for their electromechanical games. See, until the 70s, they weren't really fully electronic video games. There was sort of a mishmash of physical elements and electronic elements called electromechanical games, which Sega would really excel. Now, Sega would continue to be one of the biggest names in the world, certainly in Japan, for arcade games. But then, see, a little thing happened, and that was home consoles. Sure, there was Atari, but it really changed when arcade sales started to dip and Nintendo entered the market. So Sega jumped in with Nintendo in 1983, the same day, July 15th, I think it is, or we can correct it in there, but it's around July 15th, 1983, the Sega Mark I. This is the Mark III, but originally the Sega SG-1000 or Mark I would come out on the day of the Nintendo. See, there's a problem though, because Nintendo was leaps and bounds ahead with their Famicom. It had vertical scrolling, all these fancy graphic effects, whereas the poor old Sega, their console had little paddle controllers. It was more like an Atari, it was like an Intellivision, a ColecoVision, that kind of thing. It was very simple. There's more like a 70s. It wasn't really truly 8-bit gaming, and so Sega had to keep revising their console until they got to this one, the Master System, which is more of a direct competitor. In fact, the Master System is more powerful than NES. Unfortunately, by that point, Nintendo had all the deals and Nintendo had all the marketing, and it was too late for Sega.
Now you are playing with power.
One other interesting thing that your Famicom or NES doesn't have is these Sega cards, these little cards. This is similar to the Hudson Who cards or the NEC cards. These little cards here which can go in there. These were cheaper to manufacture than cartridges, so we had those. The Master System 2 would ditch the cards, but it's an interesting thing. I think there's over 100 of these produced. And all of these early games here, see it says here for SG 3000 or the 1000 series. So these were compatible with the Mark I up to the Mark III. It gets very confusing because Sega tends to change their hardware a lot. There's so many revisions, it's kind of hard to keep up. But the best thing to know is Mark I is the first Sega console. It was more of a throwback to the Atari age, and they wouldn't fully compete with the Famicom until they got to the Master System. By that time, it was too late, and they kind of failed. But what they did do is they continued. They didn't give up. They came out with their most successful console of all time, and that is the Genesis or MD, the Mega Drive. This big boy here. And it's a big boy because, again, a lot of add-ons and revisions. They kept changing the damn thing, which would kind of be to their detriment. See, Nintendo had a policy of being very strict with their third-party developers and saying, if you're making games for us, you're not going to make games for Sega. And this caused problems with Sega. But see, Nintendo wasn't great about their marketing in Europe. So Sega had a chance to jump in and get a lot of French and other developers, European developers to work for them. The other thing was UK was a very interesting case. They had a lot of computers like the Amiga, the Sinclair, their own computer market. So people used to playing games on those. And Nintendo was kind of brazen in pricing their stuff very expensive. So a lot of people in the UK was like, this Nintendo stuff's so expensive. So Sega came in and they undercut Nintendo by a lot of money. And also they said, hey, we've got these cartridge-based games. The thing about cartridge games compared to early computer games is there's no load time. So UK consumers weren't used to this no load time gaming, unlike American consumers that have had Atari. This was novel to the UK. And in Brazil, they licensed it to a company called Toytech. And see, Toytech kept the Master System and the Mega Drive going for, I don't know, over 10 years into the early 2000s. In fact, they keep selling Mega Drives and Master Systems in Brazil to this day, amazingly enough. Because one of the things about the Master System is it is more powerful than the NES. And so when you do a lot of 8-bit conversions, so you're taking a 16-bit era game and you want to make an 8-bit version, well, it's going to look still really good because it's a more powerful 8-bit system. Now, the other thing about the Mega Drive in the 16-bit era, of course, is the add-ons. We're going to talk a bit about this. This is the base model here. You'll get a Mega Drive 2 as well. Then you have here this 32X. See, there's a sort of in-between position when we're going from the 2D era to the 3D era. And Sega really bungled this. This is maybe one of the reasons Sega still isn't a developer of hardware, is because they kind of did a lot of stopgap measures. This one here goes in here and gives you 32-bit graphics through here. But the graphics are kind of very, early 3D. The other one is a CD add-on. We had a lot of consoles like the 3DO. Well, before we had the PlayStation, there were other consoles trying to do 3D, the Jaguar or the 3DO. But the read speeds on these CD games are pretty terrible. We played NBA Jam on this. It is really slow. So we go back to the slow load times of computers. So both of these add-ons were sort of like, okay, I've got this console here, but why don't I wait for, the next generation of gaming? Why do I want to buy all these expensive add-ons when they're going to be obsolete within a year? Sega would be much more on the ball than Nintendo or indeed Sony about releasing their stuff in China. Pretty much every Sega console did get official release in China with a number of different companies handling the marketing and stuff. We get into the Sega Saturn, and this is one of our Sega Saturns. We have a better one somewhere, but I don't know where it is, but so we're just going to go, this one's a bit bashed up. But the Sega Saturn was entering the 3D era. See, they had pretty much finished the design by 1993. Then they got a wind that Sony was working on. See, Nintendo kind of screwed over Sony. They wanted to make, you might have heard of the Nintendo PlayStation. Well, Sega was also in talks with Sony to make a console, but see, Sony wanted to go all in on 3D. Now, Sega was thinking, 2D gaming still where it's at. Sure, they were working on their M1 arcade chip with Virtua Fighter, so they had some pretty impressive 3D stuff going to the arcades, but their early model of the Sega Saturn only had, I think it was one dedicated chip, and it wasn't enough to make a full 3D world like the PlayStation, so they had to make big changes, and so they wanted to have a console that could do 2D very well, and 3D ultimately as well, but the 3D is kind of tacked on. So you have the Master System, which fails to sell very well. You have the Genesis, which sells very well, but then you have all these expensive add-ons which flop because they're buying time for this. Now, the other issue of this is because they tried to do everything. Yeah, it was expensive. It did come out before the PlayStation, but PlayStation did their ultimate mic drop, which is it was $100 cheaper. You've got a better system that's $100 cheaper. Now, ultimately, half the games for the Saturn would never leave Japan. It did alright because it has a lot of these 2D games, which I think time has really been kind to the Saturn. A lot of people love this now. There's a huge community of Saturn collectors because there is a huge game library for this, and we have discovered that 3D isn't everything. So a lot of these great 2D games that work really well on the Saturn, and they don't look so great on the PlayStation, or they didn't come out on the PlayStation, meaning that Saturn's a great choice. The 3D was a little bit iffy, and the thing with the Saturn is, the other mistake they made is Nintendo did really well because they had their mascot Mario 64, and Sonic is the mascot for Sega, but they kind of are not good with their mascots. Originally it was Alex the Kid for the Master System, then they move on to Sonic, and Sonic doesn't actually come out until the Mega Drive, and then it gets ported back to the Master System. So it's not like a lot of people go, oh yeah, Mario Brothers, that was on the Famicom. They didn't have a mascot game on the Master System for Sega. They had Alex the Kid. Then they switched to Sonic when Mario came out, but then it was already the 16-bit era. They had to go back and make an 8-bit version. Then when it comes to the 3D era, they screw up again. They have their mascot, and they have no big 3D game because their Saturn isn't good enough to handle 3D like the N64, like the PlayStation for your Crash Bandicoots. So it's going to be embarrassing. Now, you can look it up, and you can play, someone's made a fan version of this, and you can play like a 3D one. one. And the closest we got was this. It's not even really 3D. If you look at it, it's pretty sad. Sonic 3D Blast. So you never got a full 3D Sonic game until the Dreamcast. This time they really learned from their previous mistakes, okay? No hardware revisions. They've just got this one console. The pricing was really good. It's all very early internet-enabled console like that. Actually, Sega was very ahead with online functions. You got all the way back to the Mega Drive, and they had a modem for that. They even had a cable service called the Sega Channel, and you could go in there and it's sort of like downloadable games. You could get hints. You could even get cheat codes online. You would subscribe, but it was like $15 a month. It's like a subscription thing. It's PlayStation Plus, but in 1994, and that went to 1998, and there was over 250,000 subscribers for the Sega Channel. Unfortunately, all of the Sega Channel stuff is lost because it was over the cable network, so we don't have a lot of that data. But you know, they were very early on online playing. The Dreamcast, a very fondly loved console. By this time though, you know, Sega was really on the outs. They'd had failure with the Saturn, more or less. Genesis was the really only console that competed on any level, and it was just getting too expensive. And you know, 2 years after this, you had the PS2 and the Xbox, and now you have to deal with Microsoft. First, it was Nintendo versus Sega, and now you've got to worry about Microsoft entering the fray. Sony, it's too crowded. So, though very loved, maybe it came out a little bit too early for its time, and people were holding off. So, the Dreamcast would be their last piece of hardware. One thing that Sega really did do that was very good is they were very good at their backwards compatibility. In the Mega Drive, you could get a thing to play Master System games. You could get a thing to play Game Gear games. This is the Game Gear here. We actually have three. We have a Coca-Cola Game Boy, Game Gear, sorry, and I said Game Boy. This is how much handheld consoles are we think of Game Boy, because even when I'm trying to say Game Gear, I say Game Boy. They have cards like this. They're kind of interesting. So this was this is a fully color system, but it got trashed by the Game Boy, even though the Game Boy is black and white. This thing just doesn't have the battery life. You've got a few hours of battery. You got over a dozen hours of battery with the Game Boy. It's not portable. You got to have it plugged in. So that's the thing. Nintendo had the software. Nintendo, again, doesn't worry about having the best specs. It doesn't worry about being the top, just worries about design and doing what it does well. But the Game Gear did reasonably well, actually. Did reasonably well. That was okay. And another thing they had here is the Nomad. The Nomad's more of a... I think this came out of there was a similar airline. I don't know, it was Japan Airlines or something. They had a little console that you could buy. And then out of that idea came this here. And this is, you can put it in your MD games and play them on the go. So we pretty much have most of the things except for the Pico and that sort of thing. We even have all sorts of games now. Okay, so I'm just gonna have a look at some of the different types of games because it's interesting to see how they approached it. We looked before, I have the little Sega cards. We looked at some of the Japanese ones. Actually, what I didn't point out before is this one here is specifically a Mark II game. It's compatible with Mark III and Mark I, but that's the Master System Mark I, II, and then the Master System is Mark III. So this is the actual what the Mark II era carts would look like. It's something like a 1 year gap between Mark I and II and then Mark III. So the different box art they have for each variation, even though it's essentially the same system, is quite interesting. But they have a much more unified look in the West. This classic grid design, which I really love. Now, when it would change is because they weren't doing so well. So they actually sold the distribution rights in the US to Tonka for 2 years. And then they have the genre here. So they would change the cases and it's sports. So basically you've got one of these two styles. The Sega Saturn ones do these dual case, very nice. And that's actually following on from the Sega CD. So there's a continuity between the Sega CD games and the Sega Saturn games. This is a fantastic game, by the way. And whereas your Genesis is just kind of, it's still got that bit of a grid design, but then it goes like that. So yeah, I've been going through, Dreamcast just goes to like a CD case. It's very simple at this point. This was the end of the thing. Very nice designs, but you know. So, you know, this is everything we've got in our Sega collection. Is really good to dig through there, kind of take stock of what we have. So we're going to be starting out, first of all, we're going to be shooting later this week one on the Master System. So I am going to cover the Mark 1 through 3. I'm going to do that in one episode. Then we're going to move on from there and just go pretty much system by system. I'm going to just talk about the history of the system, the impact, sort of why, got this idea of Sega failing in some territories, being ahead in other territories, and giving a better picture with hindsight. But also what we're going to do is we're going to take out some games, play some of my favorite games here from Sega, and just basically, show a lot of love for this company that's no longer producing, game consoles. Maybe did a lot of stuff you didn't even hear about. Celebrate their arcade legacy, so it's going to be on Happy Gaming House coming up. The month, I'm calling it the month, it might even be more than a month, there's a lot to cover, but for the next little while, our retro gaming content is going to be focused on Sega, so I hope you join us for that and you enjoy this journey that we're going on. But for now, I'm Jesse and this was Happy Gaming House. Bye.